Okay, everybody, we're back. Paul and I are talking about innovation. What I want to do is just spend a few minutes with you talking about where we are in this conversation. Um, First, I would like to bring up this image of the work mat and remind you that in past conversations, we've talked about things such as strategic alignment, and we're going deeper into this work mat. And the work mat is really meant to help us think about all the aspects of building an innovation capacity. And you'll see today, we're talking about this idea of governance. So I'm going to back away from that and talk just for a second about innovation governance. Now, many of you may be rolling your eyes thinking, why are we talking about governance? Could we talk about anything less interesting when we talk about innovation? And what I want to do is impress upon you, and I think Paul's going to do a better job than I, talking about how important governance is in an innovation process. And let me give you an example of why I think it's so important. Today, most of you that are watching have this idea of having a governance of your existing projects and your existing ways of working. And it works well for you, how you budget, how you allocate time, how you think about risk. But if you were to take that governance model and then apply it to something like innovation, which is new and unusual, perhaps that people aren't quite capable of doing it or still learning how to do innovation. If you use that old governance model in a new setting for innovation, I think you're going to find that it doesn't work. So one of the things that Paul and I want to talk about is what we think about when we think about innovation governance, especially some of the aspects that you should be thinking about. So Paul, I know you've got a big idea around this and a number of lists are thinking about governance models. Where should we start?
I think we've got to frame governance in a very positive way of why it's so necessary and important. Let's get the eyes from stopping from rolling and to actually begin to start thinking. Let me phrase it in 4 or 5 points. Innovation is all about risk.
Mm.
When you've got risk, you need a governance to actually keep the boundaries and keep obviously the conversation within reason for management and for the person that's working on it. They need rails, guidelines. Governance
Yes.
is what that's about. So it's about risk. You got anything you want to add to that, Jeffrey?
Well, I think not only in the absence of risk, you have two options. The team, the innovation team that's working there without rails either goes too far, or in many cases, and I found this very often in a lot of corporations, they don't go far enough. They don't take on enough risk. And so the absence of some definition of how much risk is acceptable can be a negative on both sides. Most people think that teams will take on too much risk. Often I find that they don't take on enough risk.
I think my second point is innovation isn't about what you know. It's actually exploring what you don't know.
Mm.
It's actually exploring the unknowns and the uncertainties. Now, if again you have this unknown uncertainties, you need a governance. You need again somewhere to go back to point, an anchor point where you can go back and say, "Hey, look, I've got a set of unknowns here. How do we handle this? You know, what are we going to do as an organization? Do we need more resources? Do we need to bring this up to management's attention? Is it a big aha and a big opportunity for us?" So unknowns and uncertainties, I think, are a very critical second point of what governance should be about.
I agree, and I don't have much to add there, Paul. It really is a set of unknowns and uncertainties and exploration as well. So how much are we allowed to explore? How much are we allowed to discover? And without that governance model, without clarity around the governance, then you may not take on the need. You may not pursue all the exploration you need.
And I think the third point is innovation is extremely hard to defend and justify, particularly in the early stages when you are exploiting, whatever, that prototyping stage, that learning stage. Now, you need to establish some sort of process of saying, how do you set up a prototype? How do you validate it? How many stages do you take it through? But to defend it and to justify it, if you don't have, again, that rules of the road, that way of doing things, again, governance provides you that opportunity to go in and say, hey, look, I've got to defend this because I believe in it, and this is the reason why. So I think prototyping learning stage is really essential to have good governance in.
Well, we always talk about divergence and convergence, but innately, most organizations want you to converge to something. and allowing people the opportunity to diverge and to let them know how much divergence is available. That's all in that exploration and discovery that you're talking about, especially in the early phases of innovation.
You've come back to what we started this series on, which is diverge, converge.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's such an important part of this whole conversation. I think my next point is that if you don't have an open, robust, very transparent approach to innovation, you get into the potential of getting criticism, cynicism, and favoritism. And that's the death of innovation. That's the death of creativity. So to overcome those three powerful isms, as you said to me in the past, you've got to have something that's crystal clear. How would you emphasize that as important to this?
Yeah, I think you've blended two ideas together really well that we had talked about. The isms are exceptionally important. And I think favoritism is the worst, because what may happen without a clear governance framework is certain ideas or certain people's ideas may be advanced over others. That's the favoritism side. And then the favoritism can lead to cynicism. Well, my ideas don't matter, or a good idea doesn't matter if it's not sponsored by someone.
Yep.
The second idea that you blended in there very nicely is the idea of transparency. While governance may seem like overhead to some organizations, the thing that governance can do is create, and you use the word transparency, I'll use clarity. How might we work within the frames that we've been given? In the absence of any frames, I've always said that in the absence of any governance or frames, those innovation teams will form their own. They have to in order to work effectively. And that means that you've got basically every small team creating its own governance, which really is really a recipe for disaster in most cases.
But if you flip that around, what you just said is, if in the end you subscribe to good governance, when you do come up against the issue that you as a team are doing it in a different way, you can actually bring that up into the government's forum to be able to say, this is the reason why we believe what we've got isn't really working for us. How do we actually resolve that? Who do we need to address this to? Because we believe that's the right way to go. That's the defending, justifying mechanism again coming through. So it doesn't become islands of individual sort of takes on what they're going to do from a process point of view or structuring or whatever. They can bring that into this environment for it to be debated and then work through, because it could arguably be they're just doing an interpretation of something that's already there, and they hadn't really seen that argument as clearly as they should have done.
Yeah. And in to kind of wrap up this conversation, I think we've said a couple of things, at least from my perspective. Number one, I made the argument that you can't use old governance models in new work. You feel comfortable with that statement, that we definitely need an innovation governance process?
Absolutely. And I think there's better times today where innovation is so necessary and so needed. So governance of innovation is also so necessary and needed.
So that's one model. We need to move from an old model to a new model. We're not quite sure exactly what that model looks like for every organization. I'll stipulate another thing. Whereas in many cases in innovation, you may be able to pull something off the shelf, a particular tool or a particular method or a particular process. I think governance is somewhat site specific and context specific. What do you think about that? Is there a standard model that you've seen?
No, I don't think there is. And to be honest, I don't think you should go into a prescription model, as I will call it. I think you've got to, like anything, evolve. You know, you've got a lot of things that your organization will stand for. Its values, its ethics, its comfort with risk. All of these things can be, to some level, given some form of quantification or qualification. And so once you begin to put these into your government model, it becomes unique. It becomes very specific to you. So as we've talked about, and we will continue to talk around this work, Matt, in function, in its design, in its structure, in its strategy, all these things flow into governance and flow out of governance. It's a very, very important sort of middle point of the way you do your innovation. I mean, I think the other thing about governance that I'd like to put on, Jeffrey, is that organizations are very traditional. They've got an ROI justification, always. It's got to dominate. And also time dictates too often what innovation can achieve or not achieve, because they're stuck to a 12-month calendar. If you can get conversations going saying this type of innovation, distinctive, radical, needs a much longer term horizon, and it needs a different type of return on that specific investment that's being made, not on the overall commercialization point. I think, again, governance is serving its purpose. It's really enabling people within the organization to feel comfortable and go to and validate through governance how they're going to set about and do innovation.
Yeah, there's two more ideas I want to leave as we sort of exit this. One is that governance needs to be transparent. We need to be able to show people what that governance looks like. It needs to be new, it needs to be transparent. And the last thing I'll say is it needs to be what I'll call lightweight. What we're not, and I don't think either Paul or I are arguing for, is a whole bunch of rules, a whole bunch of structures, a whole bunch of forms to fill out. So both transparent and lightweight so that people understand what the expectations are, but they aren't overly onerous at the same time.
I think lightweight, don't misinterpret what that means. That means actually inspirational. It means linking into more of a visionary one, more sort of aspirational. I regard those can be quite heavy, but those for me are lightweight from this point of view, not, oh, well, we don't need to put too much in a governance model. No, I think work hard at your governance model, but don't make it overly heavy on the hard metrics, which is what I think you've just said there, Jeffrey.
Exactly. Well, what we don't want to do is create a lot of work that feels like gets in the way of doing innovation, but enough guidance and guideposts and milestones that gives people a sense of what to do and how to do it, and some sense of how they'll be measured.
And I think my last point is don't turn it into just auditing. If you do that, you've really lost what this is all about, which is that creative, allowing people to thrive and to grow and to improve. Auditing can suck the lifeblood out of organization if it's handled too heavily. Don't put structures, accountability, plans, reports, budget as your dominating governance point. It's got to be, as Jeffrey said, the lighter touch, that sort of more creative one.
Well, Paul, I think we've explored this idea pretty carefully. Any last thoughts?
No, I'm cool. I think what I want to do is, as people are beginning to pick up, I'm writing a blog or a blog post after this to be able to sort of flesh out a little bit more of either what we couldn't talk about within the time or aspects that build out from the conversation that we've had. So I'll be doing that with this governance one as well fairly quickly after this, Jeffrey.
We'll be looking forward to that. And I think the next conversation we're going to have is around innovation structures and functions and design. So hopefully we'll follow on with that fairly quickly.
Look forward to it, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Paul.
Take care.